The morning they put her out, snow was falling. Not a polite dusting, the kind that settled on the yew hedges at Thornfield Park and made the lawns look like something painted on porcelain. This was a driving, horizontal thing, the sort that arrived off the moor without announcement and found the gaps in every coat, every shawl, every small and inadequate preparation a person in her position was permitted to make. Miss Cecily Harrow stood at the servants' entrance of a house that had been her father's house, that was her father's house in every document she had ever seen, and she held a single leather satchel against her side and did not look back. She had learned, in the 8 weeks since her father's death, that looking back was a kind of wound she could not afford. The footman who had delivered the letter of removal, not to her personally, but to the solicitor in Hartmoor, who had forwarded it to her at the inn where she was briefly lodging, was a boy of perhaps 17 who had known her since she could walk the length of the gallery without counting the portraits. He had not been able to meet her eyes. That, more than anything else the Harrow trustees had managed in the weeks since the funeral, had told her what she needed to know about the shape of the thing pressing against her. The letter was from Mr. Bernard Grigg. He was her father's second cousin once removed, a man Cecily had met precisely 4 times before the funeral, and he now held himself to be the rightful heir to Thornfield Park, under a codicil her father had apparently added to his will in the autumn of the previous year. A codicil, her solicitor had told her, with the measured regret of a man who had been in this room many times before, that was entirely in order. She was 23 years old. She had no money of her own beyond the small amount her mother had settled on her at 17. She had no near relatives in England. She had the satchel, and she had 3 months to find proof that the codicil was a forgery, or she would lose every wall, every window, every blade of estate grass she had grown up inside. If you have ever stood outside a house that was yours and understood that the law and the truth were briefly different things, you know what she carried with her into the cold. Stay close, because what she did with that knowledge was the making of her. She walked the 5 miles to Hartmoor in the snow. It was the town's winter market day, which meant the square was crowded enough that no one paid special attention to a young woman in a good wool coat that was getting wet. The inn was full. The posting house was full. She went instead to the only lodging she could afford for more than a week at a time. The house of her father's old housekeeper, Mrs. Alderton, who had retired to Hartmoor 3 years prior, and who answered the door in an apron dusted with flour, and said only, "I was wondering when you'd come," and stepped back to let her in. Cecily sat at Mrs. Alderton's kitchen table and drank her tea and looked at the codicil. It was a single page, handwritten, and it bore her father's signature in the bottom right corner. The signature that she had watched him produce 10,000 times in her life, and that looked, on this page in this light, above the line of text that removed her from everything she had ever known. Not quite right. Not wrong in any way she could name with certainty. The loop on the H of Harrow closed a fraction too early. The date beside the signature was October the 14th, which she happened to know was the date her father had been confined to his room with a fever that left him too weak to lift his own correspondence for 11 days. She was not a solicitor. She was not a magistrate. She was not anything the law would hear. She looked at the codicil for a long time, and then she set it down. And she asked Mrs. Alderton if she knew who the magistrate for the Hartmoor district currently was. Mrs. Alderton said it was the Earl of Norfield. The new Earl, she added, who had come into the title 18 months ago, and who had not, in that time, done anything that anyone could point to as evidence of whether he was going to be useful or ornamental. He was said to be very cold. He was said to keep to himself. He was said to have let the previous magistrate's entire staff go and replaced them with men he had brought from Norfield Hall, which was either evidence of reforming efficiency or unsettling arrogance, and no one in Hartmore had yet determined which. "Has he a Christian name?" Cecily asked. "Edmund," Mrs. Alderton said. "Edmund Vane, Lord Norfield." Cecily wrote that name at the top of a blank page in her small journal. Then she wrote the date of the codicil, and the date of her father's fever, and the name of the physician who had attended him, and the name of her father's own solicitor who had not drafted the codicil, and had apparently not been consulted about it, and who had learned of its existence only at the reading of the will. She wrote until the candle burned low. Then she went to bed and slept. And when she woke, the snow had stopped, and the light was gray and flat, and looked very much like a problem that had no easy solutions. She went to the magistrate's office. The office of the Hartmore Magistracy was a stone building behind the posting house, long and low, with windows set deep enough to keep out the wind, and a door that sat slightly off its frame and admitted a thin, cold line of air regardless. The clerk at the front desk was a young man with ink on 3 of his fingers, who looked up when Cecily came in and said, "There is a queue." "I see," she said. "Is it possible to leave a written inquiry?" "For the magistrate directly?" "Yes." He looked at her with the practiced wariness of a man whose job was to protect someone's time. "The magistrate reviews written inquiries on Thursdays, Miss Harrow," she said. "Miss Harrow, I am the daughter of Mr. George Harrow of Thornfield Park, and I have reason to believe that the document being used to dispossess me of my family's estate was forged." The clerk's pen stopped moving. "I have evidence," she said. "Not the kind that can be conveyed in a written inquiry. I would like to request an audience." The door behind the clerk's desk opened. The man who came through it was perhaps 34 or 35, with dark hair cut close and a face that had been assembled with more economy than warmth, all straight lines and a jaw that gave nothing away. He wore a dark coat with no ornamentation worth noting, and he was looking down at a document in his hand, and he said without looking up, "Griffiths, what is the Alderton boundary dispute reference?" And then he looked up. His eyes, which were a gray so dark they were nearly charcoal, moved from the clerk to Cecily and stayed there. "This woman," the clerk said, a fraction too quickly, "claims to have evidence of a forged document, my lord. I was explaining the Thursday inquiry process." The Earl of Norfield looked at Cecily with an attention that was not warmth, was not sympathy, was not anything she would have named as invitation. It was the quality of a man who had learned to look at things very carefully before he put them down again. "What document?" he said. "A codicil to my late father's will," Cecily said. "Signed, allegedly, on the 14th of October. My father was bedridden with fever from the 12th of October until the 23rd. I have the physician's name, and I am prepared to produce him." The Earl looked at the clerk. Then he looked back at her. There was a silence of perhaps 4 seconds that felt considerably longer. "Come in," he said. She had prepared herself for skepticism. She had prepared herself for the well-practiced neutrality of a man who had heard a great many claims in a great many small offices, and who had learned to protect his energy accordingly. She had not prepared herself for the quality of attention the Earl brought to the documents she spread across the corner of his desk, which was not warmth, but was something close to ferocity. The kind of focus that was also, in its way, a form of respect. He did not ask her to simplify. He did not ask her whether she was sure. He picked up the codicil and the letter from her father's physician, which she had obtained the day before from the man's retired partner in Hartmore, and he read them both in full, and said nothing. The room was warm, which she had not expected. There was a fire behind her, and the window to her left admitted pale winter sun, and on the desk between them was a small figure carved from dark wood, a bird of some kind, a swift or a marten, smooth from handling. She found herself noticing it the way one notices objects in a room when one is trying very hard not to notice the person sitting on the other side of it. "Miss Harrow," he said at last. "The physician. Dr. Thomas Finch, retired. He has lodgings in Hartmoor, at the sign of the Three Bells. He attended my father throughout the fever, and will confirm the dates. And your father's solicitor, Mr. Paul Ross, of Ross and Collier in Lincoln's Inn. He was not consulted about the codicil and learned of it at the reading. He has written to me twice to express his concern and his willingness to provide a statement. You have his letters." "I have them." He looked at her with that same quality of attention, calibrated and containing nothing she could easily read. "You have prepared this well," he said. "I had some weeks," she said, "and I am not willing to lose my father's house to a man who was not in my father's study in October and did not witness his signature." The Earl set the documents down, squared them, and put his hands flat on the desk, and looked at her in a way that felt, for a brief and unsettling moment, as if he was not looking at the case at all, but at something beneath it. Something she had not known was visible. "Leave me the physician's address," he said. "And your letters from Mr. Ross." She left them. She walked back to Mrs. Alderton's through the pale winter light, and did not permit herself to feel anything yet. The Earl sent for Dr. Finch on Tuesday. Cecily knew because Mrs. Alderton's neighbor, a seamstress named Prewitt, who kept track of the comings and goings of the magistracy's messengers with the dedication of a minor intelligence service, reported that a rider in Norfield livery had been to the Three Bells before 9 in the morning. She knew because Mrs. Alderton told her. She knew because she was making herself be patient in a town that was not her town, in rooms that were not her rooms. And patience, under those conditions, required a great deal of small evidence to feed on. She had written to Mr. Ross. She had also, because she had nothing else to do with her evenings, and because the mind will turn to what it finds arresting regardless of instruction, thought a great deal about the Earl's desk, and the small wooden bird on it, and what it was doing there, worn smooth as it was, as if someone had held it often and for many years. She thought about his face, which was not a face she could read, and which she was not, she told herself firmly, attempting to read. She was attempting to recover her father's estate. She was not attempting anything else. On the Thursday of that week, she was in the market square selecting a pound of dried currants for Mrs. Alderton when she heard her own name spoken behind her, in a voice she did not recognize. She turned to find two women she did not know, ladies of middling station by their dress, in conversation with a third woman whom she recognized as Lady Partridge, a neighbor from the county who had attended her father's funeral, and who had, at the reception after, looked through Cecily as if she were glass. "That is the Harrow girl," Lady Partridge said, not troubling herself to lower her voice. "The one making claims at the magistracy. Poor thing. She was always a little above herself." Cecily turned back to the currants and paid the vendor, and did not look in Lady Partridge's direction again. She walked back through the square with her chin level and her pace even, and she did not think about what it felt like to hear herself described as above herself in a square that she had walked since childhood. She thought instead about the physician's dates. She thought about the loop on the H. She did not permit herself anything else. On the following Monday, a messenger arrived at Mrs. Alderton's door with a note in a handwriting Cecily did not recognize, which turned out to be the Earl's. It asked if she would attend the magistrate's office at 11 o'clock on Wednesday morning. It said that Dr. Finch had been interviewed and his testimony recorded. It said that a copy of the relevant portion of Mr. Ross's statement had also been received. It said nothing else, and it was signed with a single large V that occupied the bottom third of the page. She was there at 5 minutes before 11. The clerk showed her in without the cue. The Earl was at his desk, and the small wooden bird was where it had been. And he was reading something, and he looked up when she came in and said, "Sit down," in the tone of a man who said, "Sit down," when what he meant was that there was something important coming, and he would prefer she were not standing when it arrived. She sat. He had, spread across his desk, more documents than had been there the first time. She could see at the top of the nearest stack a letter in a hand she recognized as Mr. Raws's. There was another page beneath it, dense with text that she did not recognize, and below that, unmistakably, the codicil. "I have received," the Earl said, "a full statement from Dr. Finch confirming that your father was confined, febrile, and in no condition to write his own name without assistance on the 14th of October, and that he, Dr. Finch, attended him on that date and would have been present for any document signing of consequence. He was not sent for." "No," Cecily said. "I have also received a sworn statement from Mr. Raws confirming that the codicil was not discussed with him, that your father had given him no prior instruction of this nature, and that the signature, in his opinion, does not correspond precisely with the samples in his files." He paused. "I have also, independently, engaged a man in York who makes his living examining disputed documents. He examined the codicil this morning." Cecily held very still. "He is of the opinion," the Earl said, "that the signature was traced from a sample. Specifically from a sample of your father's correspondence, and specifically by someone with access to that correspondence and a reasonable steadiness of hand, but no great skill at the practice." She had known it. She had known it from the loop on the H, and she had known it from the dates. And she had known it in the way one knows a thing that one is not yet permitted to act on. The knowing that lives in the body before the mind catches up. And still, hearing it confirmed in that precise and measured voice, she felt something move in her chest that she had been keeping very quiet for a very long time. Her hands were in her lap. She looked at them. "Miss Harrow," the Earl said. She looked up. "Are you all right?" he said. Not with warmth, exactly, but with the attention she had come to recognize as his form of it, the quality that meant he was actually asking. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I am." She took a breath. "What happens now?" What happened now was the kind of procedural movement that does not make for drama, but makes for justice. The Earl convened a formal hearing, which was his right under the law. He summoned Bernard Grigg, who arrived in Hartmoor 2 days later with his own solicitor and the bearing of a man who had not expected this development and was doing his best to look as if he had. He summoned Dr. Finch, who attended in person. He requested the original of Mr. Raws's statement, which arrived by express post within 4 days. He also, at some point during those 4 days, came to stand beside Cecily at the counter of the lending library on Hartmoor's East Street, where she had gone to return Mrs. Alderton's borrowed book and found herself unable to leave without taking one of her own. She did not hear him come in. She was reading the first page of a natural history of British birds, which she had taken from the shelf because it had a swift on the cover. And she was thinking about the small wooden carving on his desk. And she turned and found him standing close enough that she would have had to step back to look at him properly. And so instead looked up, which was its own difficulty. "Miss Harrow," he said. "My lord," she said. There was a silence. He looked at the book in her hands. "Hirundo apus," he said. "They winter in Africa. They do not touch the ground for 10 months out of 12. She looked at the bird on the cover. "The carving on your desk," she said, before she could prevent herself. Something moved in his face that was not quite anything. and then settled again. "My son made it," he said. "He was 7. He died the following winter." He said it in the level, practiced tone of a man who had said it many times and had learned to say it without the words breaking. "I was in London. He had a fever of the chest. I had been told it was not serious." She did not say she was sorry. She had learned, in the weeks since her father's death, that sorry was not the word one wanted, that it was a word that slid off the surface of grief and did nothing for the interior of it. She said, "He chose the swift." "He said it was the fastest bird alive," the Earl said. "He wanted to know if anything could catch it." "Nothing does," Cecily said. He looked at her for a moment. That was perhaps 2 seconds longer than it needed to be, and she felt it in the region behind her sternum, the particular awareness of being seen by someone who was usually very careful about where they looked. "The hearing is set for Friday," he said. "Be there at 10. He took a book from the shelf beside her, returned it, and left. She stood in the library for a long moment after the door closed, and breathed, and told herself that what she was feeling was the anticipation of a legal proceeding. She did not believe herself. The hearing was held in the magistrate's chambers with a clerk and 2 witnesses present, and it lasted 4 hours. Bernard Grigg's solicitor was competent and well prepared, and had clearly been told that the hearing was a formality, which it was not. He conducted it with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, and he asked questions that were simple and direct, and that had the effect of placing each participant exactly where they were, with nothing false added and nothing true omitted. Bernard Grigg was asked when he had last seen the late Mr. Harrow. He said, "Last Christmas." He was asked whether he had been present at Thornfield Park in October of the previous year. He said no. He was asked whether he could explain how the codicil had come to be in a filing box in Thornfield's study that had not been opened since March, according to the housekeeper's log. He said he could not explain it. He was asked, quietly and without inflection, who else had access to Mr. Harrow's correspondence. There was a pause. The Earl looked at him with those dark gray eyes and waited. Bernard Grigg's solicitor leaned to whisper something, and Bernard Grigg sat back in his chair, and the color left his face in a way that was not the color of innocence. Cecily watched and did not feel triumph. She felt something quieter and more animal than triumph. The specific sensation of a truth that had been living only in her own body, finally arriving somewhere else. The document examiner's report was read into the record. Dr. Finch's statement was read into the record. Mr. Ross's statement was read into the record. He made 3 notes on a sheet of paper, and then he set the pen down, and he looked at Bernard Grigg, and he said, "The codicil is a forgery. The estate of Thornfield Park, as established by Mr. George Harrow's original will of 1812, passes to his daughter, Miss Harrow, unencumbered. Any party wishing to dispute this finding may do so through the courts, at which point this evidence will accompany the case." A pause. "I would not recommend it." Bernard Grigg left the chamber with his solicitor, and neither of them said anything. Cecily sat in her chair until the clerk had collected all the documents and the room was nearly empty. And then she stood, and she looked at the magistrate's seal on the copy that had been placed before her, red and exact in its impression, and she thought about the morning they had put her out, the driving snow, the footman who could not meet her eyes. The Earl was still at his desk. He was signing something. The same steady hand she had watched for 2 weeks produce decisions and requisitions and letters of summons as if certainty were a physical property of the man rather than a choice. "Miss Harrow," he said without looking up. "My lord." "You should be able to return to Thornfield by the end of the week, once the formal record has been entered." He looked up. "Is there anything else you require?" It was not quite a question, and not quite a command. It was the third thing, the thing she had been slowly learning to hear as something other than coldness. "Nothing," she said. "Thank you." He looked at her for one of those measured moments. "You gathered the evidence yourself," he said. "You identified the physician. You secured the statement. You came here." He paused. "I administered what the law permits. What happened today was not my doing. It was yours." She felt that in a different place than she had expected. She nodded once and turned to go. And then she stopped, because she could not quite help it, and looked back, which she had told herself she would not do. The small wooden Swift was on the corner of the desk where it had always been, and he had his hand resting near it, not touching it, and he was watching her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, which was not neutral at all. "The house will be cold," he said. "It has been empty." "Yes," she said. "There is an estate next to Thornfield's north border," he said. "Norfield Hall. The kitchen fire burns through the night, and my housekeeper, Mrs. Brand, does not sleep before midnight and would not find the request unusual." A pause, barely perceptible. "Should you find Thornfield uninhabitable before it is aired and warmed?" She stood in the doorway of the magistrate's chamber and looked at Edmund Vane, Earl of Norfield, who was not making her an offer, precisely, who was issuing what sounded very much like a logistical suggestion, in the level, careful voice of a man who had not, in the past 3 years, said anything to anyone that he had not weighed first. "That is very practical," she said. "It is," he said. There was the smallest shift at the corner of his mouth. "I am a practical man." She went back to Mrs. Alderton's and sat in the kitchen and ate a piece of bread with butter and thought about practicality for a very long time. The week that followed was both simpler and more complicated than anything that had preceded it. Mr. Ross arrived in Hartmoor on Thursday morning and spent 2 hours with her at Mrs. Alderton's kitchen table, confirming the details of what had been entered into the record and explaining what would happen next with the estate accounts, which turned out to be more complicated than the codicil, in that her father had left 3 creditors requiring settlement before she could draw freely on the rents. None of this surprised her. Her father had been a gentleman and an impractical one, and she had known since she was 15 that the estate's books were imperfect, and she had helped him with them, which was why she knew where to look for things. It was also why, on Friday morning, when she walked through Thornfield Park's servants' entrance for the second time in 3 weeks, she knew exactly what she was looking for. She found it in her father's study, in the filing box that the hearing had already established had not been opened since March, in a second slimmer envelope tucked behind the ordinary correspondence. A set of letters from her father to a solicitor in Edinburgh, dated 4 years prior, establishing a trust for the value of Thornfield's library, several hundred books, some quite old, in her mother's name, and from her mother's name into Cecily's, and never dissolved. She had not known about it. Her father had not told her. She suspected he had intended to, and that time had done what time does, and that the library trust had sat in its envelope for 4 years, waiting for someone to find it. She sat in her father's chair in her father's study, and held the letters and thought, with a precision she had not allowed herself before, that she missed him. She thought about the small wooden bird on a man's desk. She thought about the particular courage of keeping it there, in the daily line of sight, where it could still be a loss and also a companion. The Hartmoor assembly took place 3 Fridays after the hearing, and she was not certain she was going to attend until Mrs. Alderton told her, with the practiced certainty of a woman who had raised 5 children, that she was going and would wear her blue muslin and would not spend another evening of her youth with a ledger book, The assembly rooms were a long gallery above the posting house, lit by 12 candelabras and full of the county's assembled opinion on every subject, including, she could see within the first 10 minutes, on her. Lady Partridge was there, with the 2 women from the market square, and they stood at the far end of the room in a configuration that suggested they had been watching the door and had not expected her to come through it. The Harrow girl, she heard quite clearly, across perhaps 15 feet of crowded room. Still above herself, apparently. One wonders what she told the magistrate. The woman speaking was not Lady Partridge. It was one of the others, younger, with a confident voice shaped by a lifetime of being correct in most of the rooms she had entered. Cecily did not look toward her. She took a glass of negus from the footman's tray and stood where she was and watched the candles. A hand appeared at the periphery of her vision, holding a glass. She knew who it was before she turned. She had, she realized, learned the quality of the air around him. He handed her the glass in exchange for hers, which he gave to a passing footman, and stood beside her at the edge of the room, and said nothing. He was in dark blue, which she had expected, and the cravat was precisely tied. And he was looking at the center of the room with the expression that she now understood was not indifference, but a form of attention so contained it only read as stillness. "Lady Partridge is staring," she said quietly. "Yes," he said. "The woman in pink has said my name twice." "I heard her," he said. She turned her head slightly to look at him, and found him already looking at her, and held the look for a moment that had no comfortable name. "Are you going to say anything?" she asked. "Not if you do not wish me to," he said. "You are entirely capable of managing this room without my assistance." "I know," she said. "But I would not object." He set his glass down on the side table, and he crossed the room. It was not a dramatic movement. He did not stride. He did not make a show of it. He walked at the pace of a man who had somewhere to be, and he arrived at the small cluster of women near the far wall, and he inclined his head to Lady Partridge and said in the perfectly level voice she had heard conduct 4 hours of legal proceedings, "Lady Partridge, Miss Harrow will be taking her father's seat on the Hartmoor Parish Council in the new year. I have seconded the appointment." He let that settle for precisely 1 second. "She requires no one's leave to be in this room." He came back. He stood beside Cecily and picked up his glass and looked at the candles again. "That was more than the minimum," she said. "Yes," he said. "It was." They stood in that warm, crowded room and listened to the music beginning at the far end, and Cecily felt something she had not permitted herself to feel in a very long time, which was the particular ease of standing next to someone who already knew what she was worth and did not require her to demonstrate it. The winter deepened. Cecily returned to Thornfield and opened every window for a day and rebuilt the fire in the study and wrote to Mr. Ross about the Edinburgh Trust and to 2 tenants whose rents had gone uncollected in the confusion of the autumn, and to Mrs. Alderton with £6 that she owed for 3 weeks of lodging, and the specific warmth of the kitchen table, and she sat in the evenings and worked through the estate books, and found that the shape of her father's debts was manageable, barely, but manageable. She found, on the second Thursday, a note under the door. It was from the Earl. It invited her to dine at Norfield Hall that Saturday, if she was not otherwise engaged. It said that Mrs. Brand had made a particular stew that kept well and that she had been refusing to alter the recipe for 17 years, and that the library held a full run of the philosophical transactions of the Royal Society, which he believed would interest her more than the birding volume. She wrote back that she would come, and that she was interested in the birds and the philosophical transactions both, and thought he might consider adding a window in his library because the one she had glimpsed from the drive faced north and admitted no useful light. He wrote back that the north window was a structural matter and not subject to her opinions. She arrived on Saturday in the dark, because the December days were short. And Mrs. Brand opened the door and looked at her with the specific attention of a woman who had been waiting to make an assessment and had now made it, and said, "The Earl is in the library. I will bring the stew in 20 minutes." The library was where she had glimpsed it from the drive, long and lined and warm, with the north window she had mentioned and 3 others that did admit useful light and were simply not visible from the approach. He was standing at the far end with a book in his hand and the small wooden swift on the shelf beside him. Here too. Or perhaps he had brought it. And he looked up when she came in and said, "The window admits adequate light for 8 months of the year." "I was wrong," she said. "I am sorry." He set the book down. "You were not wrong about the north aspect," he said, "but the other windows compensate." "Then we are both partially right," she said. He looked at her for one of those moments. "Yes," he said. "I suppose we are." They ate Mrs. Brand's stew, which was in fact very good, and talked about the philosophical transactions and about the swift and about what it meant to keep something that hurt to look at. And he said that the alternative was to put it away, and that he had tried that in the first months, and had found that he kept looking for it in the same place, and feeling its absence more acutely than its presence had ever cost him. And she said that she understood exactly what he meant. And they sat across from each other in the firelight of his dining room in December and did not say anything for a moment. And it was entirely comfortable. She came back the following Saturday, and the one after that. There was no announcement in those weeks, no declaration, no procedural confirmation of the thing that was accumulating between them, like the deposits she had described to herself across the months of his deniable attention. A hand that steadied her coat at the door in a wind, a morning when she arrived to find he had already written to Mr. Ross on her behalf about a secondary creditor's claim, an afternoon when she found him at Thornfield's gate with 2 horses, and an expression that conveyed without words that he had come because he had thought she might want company on the Northfield, and that he was correct. She did want company. She wanted his specifically. And she had stopped pretending otherwise sometime around the 2nd Saturday in January. He came to her in the Thornfield Library on a Tuesday in February, which was not a Saturday, and which told her, when she heard Mrs. Hammond show him in, that something had changed in the calculation. He stood in the doorway of the library that had been her father's library. That was now hers, with the afternoon light behind him and the cold still in his coat. And he looked at her at the desk with her ledgers, and he said, "Cecily." It was the first time. She set the pen down. "I am not good at this," he said. Not apologetically, but in the same level honest tone he used for everything, as if this were another kind of evidence being presented for consideration. "I have not attempted it in some years, and I am aware that the last time I attempted anything of the kind, I was younger and considerably less aware of what could be lost." "Edmund?" she said. He stopped. "I know," she said. "I know what you are. I know what you lost. I know what it costs you to stand in a doorway and say a person's name without knowing what comes next." He was very still. "I am asking you," she said, "to say the rest of it anyway." He crossed the room in 3 strides, which was not the ballroom and was not a public reversal, which was only a woman and a man in a library in February with the light failing and no witnesses except the rows of books, and he took her hand, the right one, which had ink on 2 fingers, and held it in both of his, and said, "Cecily Harrow, I would like very much to have the right to call on you, formally." with the intention of asking you, in due course, to be my wife." 12 words were not enough for everything she felt. "Yes," she said. "I would like that too." He stood in the quiet library with her hand in both of his and the fire behind her, and she could feel his pulse in his wrists where they crossed over hers, steady and quick both at once. And she thought about the morning she had stood in the snow outside a house that was hers and had not yet known it, and about everything that the cold had turned out to contain. Which was this. Which was the specific and uncommon ordinariness of standing somewhere she was wanted and knowing it all the way to the ground. The spring came to Thornfield Park in the usual incremental way, snowdrop and then crocus, and then the long moors going green, and the study was warm, and the library windows admitted the light they were supposed to, and Mrs. Hammond learned to set 2 places at dinner without being asked. He called on her 3 times a week, and they walked the North Field, and they argued about the South Creditor and the Edinburgh Trust, and whether the philosophical transactions of 1684 were more or less interesting than the ones published in the current year. And she won the Edinburgh Trust argument. And he won the transactions argument. And neither of them kept score because they had agreed, without saying so, that in this particular matter, they were both going to be partially right, for as long as they chose. The formal question came in April, in the Thornfield Library, in the late afternoon, with the North Moor light gold through the open window and the smell of the spring in the room. And she said yes, without hesitation. And he kissed her once, carefully, as if he understood that he would have the rest of his life to refine the practice, and they did not need to rush. The small wooden Swift sat on the shelf above them. It had been there since the 2nd Saturday in January, when she had asked if she might keep it here, where it would catch the better morning light. He had said nothing, and handed it to her, and watched her put it on the shelf. And she had understood that to be among the more significant things she had ever been trusted with. That evening they sat by the fire, and the light went slowly from the room, and she was warm, and the house was hers. And outside on the moor, the first swifts had come back from wherever they spent their winters, cutting the pale April sky as if nothing in the world could catch them. Nothing could.